Now we have kind of an interesting wrap-up for the day. I'm going to ask you to come on up. We have experts on the hot seat. So this is meant to be a recap of highlights of the day. And industry analysts provide a great perspective of what's going on in the business. They listen, they talk, and they have a lot of discussion. So they've been here today listening to many of the presentations. And they're going to do a nice review for us of their thoughts for the day. So I'd like to start by introducing everyone. First we have Susan Welsh de Grimaldo. She is Director of Service Provider Strategies at Strategy Analytics. Seated to her left, Dr. Monica Paolini, founder of Senzafili Consulting. And then Mark Lowenstein, Managing Director, Mobile Ecosystems. And at the end, Chetan Sharma, CEO of Chetan Sharma Consulting. So I'm going to start by asking each of them to give me their thoughts for us on the highlights of the day. So we'll start with Susan.
Great, and it's fun being called an expert, but I think everybody here is an expert. So it's been great learning from all the different perspectives from everything and different regions. So that stands out actually as a big thing. But I actually put a couple notes here to get my thoughts together because it's hard to wrap up a huge thing with all this stuff. We could have done a lot more time on each panel. But there's 3 I's I thought of, and that's, if we include Dr. E, then it's another I. But we've got iterative. This is a process, and I think that was something that Ron Marquardt from Sprint mentioned. It's an iterative process that we're going to go through with 5G, thinking about the deployment, thinking about the investments and the return on the investments. It's an involved process. We're involving the verticals. So it was great to hear a lot of the activities in the different regions to pull in the verticals, understand and go into their world and understand their needs and how to interact. And it's inclusive. It needs to be global, and it needs to have the rural areas. As we heard, it's great to hear the examples of different markets with different needs and looking at what's happening in Brazil and other places where you do have different ways of pulling in everyone. It needs to be for everyone. It's not just a global standard. It's a standard for everyone. The amount of learning, the amount of trials, all this trial activity stuff, it's overwhelming to see the amount of learning being done and the things planned that we're still going to be learning over the next year. And I'm particularly excited to hear more on the core side and how this whole service-based architecture will play out as we go towards commercialization with the early stage. And I just wanted to mention one thing. One comment kind of jumped out with me is, it takes 9 months to grow a baby in the pregnancy. Well, you know what? You don't deliver an adult. You deliver a baby. And it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a global village to raise the next generation of wireless. If my brother told me once, if you wait till you're ready to have a baby, you'll never have a baby. So you kind of have to take a little leap of faith. And be iterative and be inventive and learn from the other industries out there that are doing things like DevOps and design thinkings and transition how we think about things and then smartly learn from each other.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Monica, your thoughts?
Thank you. That's a difficult one to follow now because she covers so much stuff. But one thing that today I thought it was refreshing and somewhat new was from the FCC and from regulation. Regulation, it's usually kind of like, something you have to go through, but it's kind of boring. And today, that was actually quite interesting to hear somebody from the FCC to really be able to address and talk about, to be very, very open and responsive, I thought, and to talk about, the regulatory changes that 5G takes. So, 5G obviously is a technology at the core, but that's only the beginning. I guess it's just like, it's the baby situation. It's just the starting point. And it's interesting to think about regulation as changing the same way. So it's not just giving some spectrum and with some licenses. It's much more than that. And it's interesting to hear that we're moving in that direction despite some of the problems with CBRS. And not everything is perfect, but it was good to hear that. The other thing is that, there is much less focus on use cases per se, which is kind of a relief because we're talking always about the same ones. There's just so many of them. And more talk about what we learn from trials. So it's like less PowerPoint and more realistic assessment of what the technology can do. So I thought that's, we're actually finding out what 5G is for real now.
Okay, Mark?
That's great. Well, first of all, I'd actually like to commend a lot of the speakers today for, I thought, we all go to a lot of conferences, we participate in a lot, but I thought the level of discussion and frankness in the presentations was really terrific, so commendation there. One area I would have liked to have seen covered a little bit more, and I think we still need a little bit more of a discussion about, is the economics of 5G, and what is this going to mean from the standpoint of how much does it cost to deliver a gigabyte of data? When we talk about the growth of traffic in video and applications like AR and VR and so on, is that how is this going to affect an operator's economics? We'd like to have seen a little bit more discussion on that. Lots of discussion about trial activities. I think it'll be really interesting. Even more, this conference will be even more interesting a year from now when we talk about some of those first commercial services that everybody's talking about that will have been launched. We get to see some real results there. And I think one encouraging takeaway for me from the discussion today is that the level of government involvement in many geographies in terms of helping to finance or creative ways of financing this, taking a bit of an alternative look at the way they're going to be doing spectrum. This is becoming a little bit of an industrial policy battle I'm seeing in some of the geographies. So it's going to be very interesting to see the way that plays out. And I guess the other sort of big takeaway for me today, when I consider other events like this that I've been at, is that a lot of discussion about midband. Less about millimeter wave in some ways and more about midband. There seems to be quite a bit of harmonization globally around midband spectrum, and I think that will help advance the discussion on midband in some countries that were lagging a bit. So I think that was sort of one big takeaway for me.
I think my three colleagues have covered everything, so not much left for me.
That's right. You get the hardest spot.
So I think kind of summary for me was 5G deployments are closer than you think, and 5G monetization is further than you think. I think given that this is the first transition that's taking place when revenues are declining, industry is facing a fundamental challenge as to how it evolves, especially the operator community, in terms of how it figures out longer term what's their sustainability model. Clearly, they got through the 4G cycle, but at the peak of the cycle, their revenue started to go down. And given that access is also starting to hit revenue peaks, there's a fundamental challenge to the industry as a whole as to, some of it can be solved by M&As, some of it solved by government participation, but in countries which are very free and open markets, people need to figure out how to collaborate and perhaps have different models to be an operator. Having said that, being an RF and systems engineer, I'm delighted to see a lot of the progress and fundamental breakthroughs in millimeter wave and how some of the mid-band and low-band activities are taking place to truly give a very holistic experience across domains and across verticals. So the focus on verticals is quite exciting, though it's also noticeable that the verticals are absent from the discussion. Meaning they're not part of standard bodies or in conferences like this, when we think that that's where the next pot of gold is, but they are absent from the discussion.
Okay, we have an opportunity for some questions here. I'm just going to make a comment responding to something Chetan said, though. They're not here, per se, the verticals. But it's interesting because if you go to like some of the telematics shows or the automotive shows, they have kind of their own take on it. Yeah. And they'll add into their program something about wireless or connected car connectivity. So it's sort of, maybe they're not in our program, but we're in their program in some ways. Okay, so let's see. Do we have any questions from anyone here? Something you may have been unclear of today.
Yes, hi,
all right.
Adlan Fela from Maravedis. I have a question regarding the role that you guys see Wi-Fi will play into the whole 5G perspective, because I haven't heard much, say, around Wi-Fi, given the fact that most of the traffic today runs in Wi-Fi networks.
Okay, somebody want to respond on Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Monica, probably.
I've been doing a lot of work on Wi-Fi, so I'm a little bit biased there. Somebody in my panel said that Wi-Fi is going to die with 5G. I don't agree with that. This is because, as you say, Wi-Fi accounts for over 50% of the traffic, the wireless traffic. So I don't think it's going to go away. Not only that, but I think that in order to have 5G, we need Wi-Fi. Without Wi-Fi, imagine that Wi-Fi disappears tomorrow. Even the 5G networks, with all the capacity that they have, assuming they're deployed, they'll still have trouble because there is so much of the traffic, so much of our applications that go through Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi meets a lot of, the Wi-Fi AX and the sort of the evolved Wi-Fi. Meets a lot of the requirements, in fact, all the requirements other than mobility that 5G meets. So I think I see Wi-Fi being an integral part of 5G.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. And I think the other thing is Wi-Fi is one way we pull in existing devices into 5G and let them tap into the benefits of 5G. If one of our first devices we'll probably see in the US will be the pucks, that'll use the Wi-Fi to get to a lot of the devices you might be using. It's not going to be something you actually sit there and play with your puck. You're going to use it for the connectivity. So I do think the Wi-Fi stays critical with 5G as well.
I agree. I had 2 points to that. Number one is we have to also look at that within the context of the evolution of the fixed network roadmap and the investments in that, DOCSIS 3.1, GPON, and emergence of G.fast and so on. That'll help drive, Wi-Fi that drafts off of that. Then the other piece that I think that does need work and would like to have seen more discussion at this event, and maybe there's an opportunity tomorrow, is what is the relationship going to be between Wi-Fi and 4G and 5G? What are, particularly improvements in terms of how they all sort of work together, because there's a narrowing, particularly with all these small cells that are going in and so on, a narrowing delta between the wide area network, a small cell network, a microcellular network, and a Wi-Fi network.
Do we have another question in the audience right here? Mike is coming. There it is.
As Monica mentioned, one of the aspects of FCC, based on discussion, that just the question I asked about FCC regulations, I think the answer was that they are still developing FCC regulation in terms of interference, emission, all of that. At the same time, I hear some companies say that they got certified product from FCC. I don't know. I appreciate if you could comment on that. What kind of certification FCC gives at this time if those standards are not developed yet, or even 5G standard is not developed?
Okay, I think he's saying that the standards haven't been finalized yet for 5G, so how can the FCC provide certification on certain type of 5G equipment? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Somebody want to answer that?
I'll refer the question to FCC.
It sounds like a question for the FCC was the answer. Okay. Any other questions in the audience?
This is Chris over there.
Chris Pearson, 5G Americas. A question for the panelists. We heard from the FCC this morning. I should say not the FCC, excuse me. We heard from the legal advisor for Commissioner Rosenworcel that they were still looking. She and he were still looking at the CBRS issues on census tracts and things like that. What's the panelists' view about CBRS being possibly sliced into licenses that are census tracts in the United States, as far as the geographic region?
I think that's really a crucial issue, how you do the licenses, and regardless of what the answer is how you do encourage a secondary market. Because there are two ways to encourage the competition. One is to have a secondary market so that, say, an enterprise or a city can use the PAL license only in a specific location. The other thing is, what is the right size? And there is no real good answer. So if you use the census tracts, it's just not a good way to go about it in principle, because the census tract is to keep track of the population. And the licenses should keep track of wireless usage, which is not the same as the population. So I think that we really need to have a new way, a new framework to think about how you allocate licenses. It's not just the CBRS issue. We should have a way to split the territory based on the network requirements, not.
I love the potential innovation that CBRS brings. I think it's really important. I think it could be a template for much of the rest of the world. But we do need to make sure, and I also really like the fact that this will encourage other service providers potentially to participate, but we do need to work here to make sure that the major operators buy into this. Otherwise, this will go sort of under-invested in, and it'll be a dud. And that would be a bad thing, particularly given what's going on with 3.5 spectrum in the rest of the world.
Do we have another question? Okay, then I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to have everyone answer, and I'm going to let Chetan start first, which makes it really hard for Susan. All right, so what is the biggest challenge for 5G?
I think business case is the biggest challenge. I think technology we have seen, it has been proven in the labs. It has been proven in the trials. The question is, I mean, to me, enhanced broadband seems to be the more logical use case in the near term, but it's not clear whether consumers are willing to pay more for it. And so are you launching the service just to ensure, just to keep the churn low, or are you really going to increase the revenue? If you're not increasing the revenue, then there are questions around how much you invest, how fast you invest, or is just a pure competitive play in a given market or not. So I think the business case is the fundamental challenge for the operators.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I think a slight similar answer to Chetan, but I would say, you know, where are the real incremental revenues going to come from here? Because we all know this is going to take, you know, to roll out real 5G, it's going to take a tremendous amount of investment over a number of years, even if it's rolled out sort of in pockets or on islands, so to speak, islands of 5G and a sea of 4G, as I like to call it. And it's quite clear that, you know, the average user, you know, ARPU or household revenue for mobile is not going to increase substantially. So then it turns to other use cases that we've talked about at this conference, like, you know, IoT and machines and so on. And I see a lot of opportunities there, but no one particular area jumps out, particularly from the standpoint of the mobile operators who are going to be largely financing the rollout. So I'm just not exactly sure where the incremental revenues come from. That's the biggest concern, because if the economics get depressed there, then we will see a slowed rollout of 5G.
So I don't think that the business model is the challenge. And I know that this is not a very mainstream kind of idea, but so setting that aside, I think that the major challenge is the complexity that 5G brings. And this is a good thing. But with 5G, you're dealing with a world where there is many more access technologies, many more ways to do things. You slice the network, you bring infrastructure to the edge. So a lot of the things that used to be nice, simple, and straight no longer will be like that. And there's going to be a lot of change in different dimensions, and we need to take everything under control and optimize it. If you don't, you're going to have the risk is that you're going to have a 5G network that is going to work a little bit better, but you're not able to get all the benefits. So there is a lot of work that we need to do, and it's not just the technology work, it's a cultural work. We have to learn to think and operate networks in a different way. That to me is a huge challenge. And so that's where I think that's going to in some ways slow down the deployment. It's not going to happen right away, not only because there is no money, but because there's so many things that we need to do differently.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think sometimes it's the cultural issues, the process issues, the way we think about things can be a real challenge to getting things done. And I think for 5G, it's not going to be how do we get there first, what's going to happen. It is coming. It's coming fast. I think we'll, a lot of ways we'll see more than we expect faster, but we'll also have that longer tail. And I think the real challenge is how do you get to the right economies of scale a little more quickly to make it affordable for more people and more things to really have 5G. So when you're thinking that trade-off, do I put 4G in this? Do I put 5G in it? Am I going to buy a device that has 5G? Maybe I'm not buying it because it's 5G, but am I going to buy this thing if I'm a consumer? It's got to get that economies of scale, and it's got to be global. We've got to have those tuning bands lined up a bit. How do we quickly move that forward to make it cost-effective?
Do we have any questions from our audience members? Okay.
Kind of playing on that same question, I think industry has to look at creative ways to reduce the various elements that make up OpEx and CapEx. And so if you look at historically, CapEx and OpEx have gone up with each cycle. And 5G, at least from where we sit today, doesn't offer dramatically new ways to reduce, say, IT costs or siting costs or power costs and so on and so forth. So unless we attack the problem at every level in CapEx and OpEx, you're fundamentally not decreasing the cost for deployment at the time when revenues are being suppressed. And so you need to get more creative about how do you go about deploying 5G.
Yeah, but the cost is not going to go down, and the revenues are not going to go up. That for sure. That we agree on it. But because the performance is better, so the per bit cost is lower, then you're gaining something there.
I do think there's some interesting opportunities to deliver differentiated levels of QoS and speeds to different types of customers as sort of an application of network slicing. We might have some to be creative around some of the regulatory rules around that in certain geographies. I guess network neutrality might not necessarily be a roadblock anymore here, but anyway, but that's the sort of thing that we're going to have to get into, I think. So it opens up all sorts of opportunities, for example, in the enterprise market for some differentiated QoS services. And we see it on the broadband side, so I necessarily see that happening in mobile.
Yeah, and I guess you're absolutely right, because when you look at the revenue per user, that's not going to happen. We're not going to start paying any more money than we currently pay, but there is other sources of revenues. So when you think about you need to think about other ways.
So I'm actually going to throw out a quick question to the audience, you don't mind. So in 2025, how many people here think that that the average household, let's just say in North America, will be paying separate fixed and mobile subscriptions, or whether you think it's going to all be one world? So who thinks it's going to be combined, fixed and mobile? Okay, and still separate, similar structure to today? The rest, everybody else? Well, so it looks like 50-50-ish, at least in terms of the vote.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out a question, too. How many people here are involved in the finance side at an operator? Like nobody, right? I mean, I have not talked to anyone who's saying, give me the money, tell me why you're going to justify this investment. And I think that's one of those little gaps. We still need a bit more discussion. 5G investment's already happening. I mean, have you heard the amount of 5G ready that I heard here today, and that migration path being thought through to be 5G ready, that's really advanced over the last year or so. So you're already making investments in 5G. You're not getting revenue from it yet because nothing's commercial on air. And even when you do get it commercial on air, how are you going to say, this is my 5G revenue and this is my 4G? Because you have 4G and 5G together at the same time, which is one of those cool new things we're getting, right? So you're not necessarily going to chalk it up to 5G versus 4G, and even your investment's going to be both. So I think we need to kind of expand our thinking about this. We're building the best networks. We're changing experience for users. We're enabling innovation in new ways. There are industries out there counting on the wireless to transform their industries. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of the big players going through digital transformation and their own transformation. So it's not 5G as a new change all by itself. Many, many things are changing. So kind of to keep it all in perspective a little bit, I think sometimes we get too hung up on some of the details of what's 5G and what's not. But obviously there's a lot of new stuff, and it's great to see the progress on that, but we need to think a bit more inclusive about it.
It's really not a step function. You go on one day. It's like you stop 4G and then everything is 5G. It's all. And when you think about it, we had the same discussion with 4G, right? And we couldn't see the business case and whatever because you cannot charge more for 4G. But that never, in practice, it was never an issue at the end of the day.
Okay. Well, this was a pretty good, lively panel, I think. So thank you. That was great. So it's the end of a long, wonderful day, and I'd like to thank you for participating as an audience. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for being part of 5G New Horizons, and our delegates for really an informative day. I have a custodial announcement. If you left items in the bag check room, they have moved the bag check room. So if you get there and the door's locked, don't freak out. Directly opposite the room number 1, which was the old room, your items were moved to meeting room number 2, directly across from the previous room. They are still there. A reminder to our speakers and our delegations, we will see you at the reception immediately after we close here today. And I look forward to seeing everyone back here tomorrow at 9 a.m. We're going to have a keynote on the Penchang 5G experience. So thank you very much.